My name's Rosalind Reed. I am the executive director of CASW. We put this program together, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you who are joining us today for a pretty unusual panel discussion. We're going to grapple with some of the most challenging stories that science writers can tackle. Science and technology, as we all know, are remaking parts of our world and creating a future that will be very different for our children. The question we want to talk about today is how can we have a serious, well-informed public conversation about topics like gene editing of embryos, technologies that link human brains with computers, geoengineering projects that could alter our climate, or artificial intelligence technology for policing or for hiring? Finally, what about bringing brains back to life? Today, we've got a way to dig into a story that's got a lot of fascinating implications and explore the journalist's role in all these questions. So we will take a deep dive into a remarkable 2019 magazine article that sparked a lively conversation among scientists, ethicists, and the NIH funders behind the scenes. So today we bring you in on these behind the scenes conversations by gathering the people who were involved. And we have here pretty much a full range from the scientists, ethicists, journalists, and even the editor involved in the story. So we want to focus in on the journalist's role and the thoughtfulness and craft that it takes to tell a story like this. So before I start, I want to thank the Kavli Foundation and its staff. Kavli funds research in these areas and neuroscience and other frontiers. And they started a conversation with CASW about the idea of planning a workshop to help science writers think about their role and how to do it well, in setting the public agenda for conversation and informing that conversation. In an age of misinformation, that's so especially important in these frontier areas. So the question that they brought us from Kavli took me to Robin Marantz Henig, a longtime freelance journalist who teaches a journalism ethics course in a science writing program at NYU. She's one of the most thoughtful people in the business, so we're very, very happy to have Robin with us, and helping bring some of the additional perspectives outside of journalism to us is Robin's co-moderator, Cara Rommelfanger, who's a neuroscientist by training and directs a neuroethics program at Emory. So Karen and Robin have together done incredible work in pulling this program together. I'm happy to hand the microphone to Karen to introduce herself.
Okay. Thanks very much for having me here, Roz. So my name is Cara Rommelfanger. I'm a neurotech ethicist and a strategist, and I'm frequently invited as a commentator on the ethical, legal, and social implications of neuroscience. And I was also interviewed on the research we'll be discussing today. So neuroethics allows me to engage the questions that brought me to neuroscience. What is the nature of mind, emotion, self? And am I just outputs of my brain, or is there more? How are we to understand and perhaps reimagine life given these uncharted territories of neuroscience discovery and development? So as Ross mentioned, my PhD is in neuroscience. My postdoctoral training is in neuroscience and neuroethics. And I'm based at Emory, and I direct a neuroethics program at our Center for Ethics. And I'm faculty in both departments of neurology and psychiatry in the School of Medicine. And in my work, it has become clear to me that neuroethics was an important innovation of neuroscience, an interpreter and guide for what emerging neuroscience could, should, and would mean for society. And I've been grateful that this sentiment has been recognized at the highest levels of government. And so now I wear a lot of hats in this space. I'm a member of the neuroethics working group of the NIH Brain Initiative that's mentioned in the article that helped provide feedback on Dr. Sestan's work as it was in progress. Dr. Ramos, who you'll meet later, leads and shepherds that group, and Dr. Johnson is also a member. I'm also co-chair of the Global Neuroethics Working Group of the International Brain Initiative, which is a consortium of 7 national level large-scale brain research projects across the globe. Dr. Ramos is a founding member of that group. And from our IBI, International Brain Initiative, stakeholders and others, we heard a consistent need for engagement of ethics within the neuroscience communication space. So we had a project funded by the Kavli Foundation to explore the landscape and possibilities for neuroethics engagement. And both Dr. Johnson and Ramos have participated in those discussions. So from that particular year's work, we have some outstanding questions. First, how can we align communication concepts and practices across experts? We learned from the past year that most scientists, maybe not unsurprisingly, don't move beyond a deficit model of communication, meaning the public is viewed as an empty vessel that needs to be enlightened with the right thinking bestowed upon them by magnanimous science experts. And while broadcast style messaging may have extreme value, it was clear that scientists were not using thoughtful intention to guide their communication strategies. So scientists also aren't prepared to respond to public reactions to their work as well. Second, how can we build trust and respect in our communities? There really isn't a healthy sense of community between communication specialists, ethicists, and scientists, where each expert is equally appreciated for the perspective and skills that they bring. When Roz contacted me about this session, I was drawn to an opportunity to share perspectives across specialists, understand more about the process and roadblocks to alignment and community building, especially when engaging science with such strong ethical implications. And I'm also looking forward to discussing some of the lessons learned from when it goes well and strategies on how to do better and to move forward together. So next up is my lead media moderator, Robin. You want to take the mic?
Sure. Thank you, Karen. I'm unmuted, right? Yes. So thanks to all of you for tuning in this morning. This is going to be fun, I hope. I'm Robin Marantz Henig. I'm a freelance science writer, have been for the past 40 years. And I've written about a wide range of issues, and the ones that are most interesting to me actually have been the ones that have raised some very difficult issues in biomedical ethics. I've written a book called Pandora's Baby about the early days of IVF research. I wrote an article about 5 years ago for the New York Times Magazine about a woman with Alzheimer's disease who wanted to end her life when she still could. I wrote an article in National Geographic about the changing definitions of death. So a lot of these issues have been near and dear to my heart for a long time. I also, as Roz mentioned, I teach journalism ethics at NYU in the Science, Health, and Reporting program. I was also president of NASW in 2014 to 2016. So when Roz came to Karen and me and was trying to figure out how to talk about this issue, it was really lucky for us to find an article that had been published just the previous summer that raised so many of these issues, the article that we're going to be talking about today. So we also were very lucky to find the author of the article and the editor of the article who were willing to talk with us. Here they are. Matt Shaer is the writer at large for the New York Times Magazine. Last year, he was an Emerson Fellow at New America, and he's co-founder, which has its first podcast out called Chameleon. Matt lives in Atlanta now, but when he lived in New York, he was also a member of my co-ed intergenerational book club, which is a very important qualification. And Mike Benoit is the editor of the article. For 5 years, he was a story editor at the New York Times Magazine. He's now at the Times working as supervising editor for narrative in their audio division. Before that, he was at Medium, GQ, and National Geographic Adventure. In a little while, we'll take a deeper dive into the story, and we'll talk about the decisions that both Matt and Mike made about how to structure it, how to put the experiment into context, the brain reanimation experiment that they were talking about. But now I'd like to just spend 10 minutes talking about the story overall. So Matt, if maybe you can start, if you can tell us in about 5 minutes how you came to the story, how you originally pitched it, and what you were excited about and what you were worried about in telling this story.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, everybody, for having me. It's fun to be able to revisit this one, which was I'm proud of this story, but it is also giving me a severe case of PTSD thinking about reporting it and writing it, because it took a lot to do. The genesis was that I had run into a family friend who works at Duke in the law department. And he had mentioned that he had heard about an experiment involving reanimated brains. And he knew a little bit about it. He knew enough to be able to sort of describe it briefly. He kept saying to me, Frankenstein is about to turn 200. I think the anniversary of Frankenstein was 2018. So this would have been it. And so he said, oh, you should go look this guy up. He's a young scientist at Yale. He seems really interesting and compelling. There are a lot of ethical issues there, but science itself is really fascinating. And I found, he wrote down Nenad's name, and I wrote Nenad an email out of the blue. And I went back to look for it recently. I think that we eventually talked by phone, but I know that Nenad's main reaction was, how do you know about this? Because at that time it was not public at all. Later, actually, interestingly enough, MIT, if I'm getting the chronology right, in about, I think it was late 2018, early 2019, MIT had published an article breaking the news that Nenad was working on this experiment. But at the time when I reached out to him, no one knew about it. So he had said, if you can give me a little bit of time, I will give you the exclusive, but you have to give me time. And so from there forward, I proceeded to bug him with alarming regularity every month until he was completely sick of me, I'm sure. And somewhere in there, I started talking to Mike. At that point, we worked on a bunch of stories together, some that had some technical aspects, but none that were, super scientific like this one was. And I mean, Mike will be able to recall this and talk more about it, but I think that it was pretty quickly a go, as long as I could get the access, just given how many issues were at play. And as far as the rewards and challenges going into it, I mean, I think the rewards of writing about this were self-evident. It was so fascinating. It was literally about life and death, right? And it had a really compelling protagonist at the middle of it. And Nenad ended up being more compelling than I had hoped. But, the challenges were also self-evident. I was a terrible math and science student. And I remember telling Nenad, well, you have to talk to me in an 8th grade level when we started talking. And then I was like, well, I think maybe you need to talk to me in a 1st grade level, because even the 8th grade level was not getting through. So I was worried about that. And we can get into more of that. But I knew that from the outset, right? I knew that would be a huge, huge challenge. So as I was waiting for Nenad to say, okay, come to Yale and we can start to talk, I read as much as I could about the science and tried to absorb what I could.
Well, thank you, Matt. I find it actually interesting that the worries that you had going into it were not about the ethics that you might be raising by writing about this experimentation, but just whether you were up to it technically. So we'll get back to that, because I want to move over to Mike now. Mike, can you describe, I mean, Matt makes it sound like it was kind of clear that it would be a go from the beginning. So what was it about this article that grabbed you? And did you have trouble convincing your higher ups to also go for it? How did you pitch it to them? And what worried you about it?
Yeah, I mean, Matt and I had, hi everyone. Matt and I had, I think we'd just come off of a Sean Hannity story. So it couldn't have been more different. And then most of our pitching happened in the course of conversations on the phone. And he said, he just sort of said it as an aside one day. I just got off the phone. I talked with someone who was telling me about someone who was, I think you did use the word like reanimating or something fairly general. At that point, we really didn't know what we were getting into. And he said reanimating pig brains. And I think that day I went on my little story schedule and wrote down pig brain. And from then on, it was it did require more of a pitch than that. We talked for a while, and of course, usually a lot of our story pitches come in after a newspaper story has been written, or you've been able to read some things elsewhere in the press. And this was unusual in that we didn't have any of that, and we were waiting to see not just about access, but what the story really was. And so we'd sort of gotten in very early, which was great, but it had to sort of unfold. And of course, we had to get permission from Nenad, but also understand what we were actually doing. So that took a little while. As Matt was calling him every month, we'd talk about it, and we'd sort of say, you know, how's it going, and what do we think the story is, and as far as, you know, convincing other people in the office, it was a pretty, you know, there was a lot of questions about, you know, the tech, like everyone was interested immediately, but we didn't collectively know what the story was. So it was a pretty quick assignment, but then it was just up to Matt and myself to figure out exactly where it would go. And of course, the questions on a science story for me were, you know, I do mostly Matt and I mostly edit narrative pieces with like an actual story to tell in terms of progression and action happening and scenes, and in lab work, you often don't get a lot of that. And so the questions I had were, of course, unpacking the science, but also just how is this story going to be told? Who, you know, what are we actually following here? And I think, you know, related, would the scientists involved actually give us that level of detail where we could actually see this thing happening, understand how it happened, understand their thinking in each step of the way. I mean, that's a big commitment, and a lot of scientists aren't used to that kind of level of reporting. So those were my questions going in, and it just lived as pig brain on the schedule for months.
Well, that's so interesting. So both of you were thinking about it in terms of the technical, just writing of a narrative story. Where are the scenes? How specific can I be? How detailed can I be? And these ethical questions that we're here to talk about were not prominent in your brains right then. So we're going to move now to our panel of experts, who are, Karen is going to take over and ask them basically what they were thinking when they were first approached by Matt to participate in this story.
Great, thanks so much. So for the next 15 minutes, we'll be talking with our panelists who are involved in various stages of this writing, I guess on the other end, who are very concerned about ethics, all three of them. And I actually think that I'm hearing that Matt and Mike were also concerned. So I'm interested in hearing a bigger conversation about that later. So first I'll introduce Dr. Sid Johnson. She's a philosopher, bioethicist, neuroethicist, and associate professor of bioethics and humanities. Her current research in neuroethics focuses on ethical issues related to brain injuries, neurotrauma, brain death, and disorders of consciousness. And she was interviewed for a number of reports on Dr. Sestan's work. So Sid, given your expertise, can you describe a bit about your perception of the ethical issues raised by stories like this, and perhaps your hopes and fears as you were interviewed for these stories? And a side note is that Sid also brings a unique lens given her background in journalism way back when. So I think she brings a very unique perspective. So Sid, in the next 5 minutes, the floor is yours. Oh, Sid, perhaps
I'm unmuted. There we go. I did work as a journalist for quite a long time while I was in grad school studying philosophy. And I'm interested, as Karen said, in brain injuries, disorders of consciousness, and brain death, but also animal ethics, and especially animal research. So this research kind of hit all the buttons for me in terms of what I was interested in. And, you know, the obvious ethical issues that came up when I first heard about this, when it was presented at Duke, were we were discussing the potential for what this means for brain death, and brain death being somewhat contested in terms of whether or not it counts as real death, and of course, whether these pig brains might count as still being dead. And I think at the time, most of us concluded they did still kind of meet the criteria for what we consider to be brain death. But beyond the potential for sort of cellular recovery in these brains is the potential or the possibility of recovering brain function, including consciousness. So clearly that is an ethical issue that people were concerned about, pigs are intelligent mammals, they're conscious. But we're actually not very good at detecting consciousness in non-paradigmatic cases. In disorders of consciousness, there's a misdiagnosis rate of about 40%, where people who appear to be unconscious, who behave as if they are unconscious, are actually conscious and misdiagnosed. So my main worry was, if consciousness did somehow emerge in these brains, we wouldn't know it, and we would have no way of knowing it. I'm not at all convinced that's possible for brain X brains to be conscious. And I think that angle of the story was sort of blown out of proportion by a lot of the coverage of this. You know, extracorporeal brains of decapitated pigs would count as being devastatingly injured, and devastatingly injured brains tend not to recover consciousness in 3 or 4 days based on what we know from humans. But I'm also convinced that if those brains were conscious, we would have no way of knowing that. And if brain X could be used to perfuse brains for longer periods of time, then I think the scenario might change, but this remains to be seen. But there's really interesting potential for this research, because we have severe brain injuries in humans, including brain death, for which we currently don't have good treatments. And that includes stroke. So if there's neuroprotective potential in brain X that could be used to save injured brains, then I think there's actually a really compelling case to study it in donated human brains. But there again are concerns about the potential, what might happen to those brains, and the possibility of consciousness get really amplified. One thing I thought was kind of overlooked in most of the coverage about this was that there's real potential here to limit the number of animals that are currently used in brain research. So these pigs that were used were killed for meat, and millions of pigs are killed every year for meat, and that's a rich source of biological material for experimentation. So I think the thinking that went into the choice of material to use here was really creative. And I would love to see more neuroscientists be creative in that way and think of alternatives that they might be able to use to actually harming and killing animals for research. You know, if we're going to kill animals for meat anyway, and of course there are lots of reasons why maybe we shouldn't, but if those animals will be killed anyway, being able to use the biological materials that are left could potentially save money, advance research, advance progress, and save other animals from being harmed.
Wonderful. Thank you for giving us that quick rundown of issues and expanding our lens for thinking about this. Next, we'll bring up Dr. Nenad Sestan, who is a professor of neuroscience, of comparative medicine, of genetics and psychiatry at Yale. His recent NIH-funded research related to this radical brain tissue preservation, also called restoration in the article, is subject of our conversation today, and he's kind of been in the spotlight. So I'll let him take the next 5 minutes to describe. Can you describe a little bit how it felt to be approached by Matt? We heard from Matt that you said, how did you hear of this? And also your initial thoughts about what you hoped would come across in the reporting of your work. I know you've been very mindful of that, and also what could go wrong with the reporting.
Thank you. And I was totally shocked and unprepared, I have to tell you. And I actually really was so worried, because I really did not think about this. I thought that when I first saw the email, I thought that he wants to write about something that we were about to publish that is totally unrelated. And I just was completely shocked and did not expect that. And just to, you know, and the reason, you know, I was so immersed in doing these experiments and thinking, and, you know, sometimes you have to really think deeply about what you are doing and preparing and stuff like. So I really never crossed my mind that somebody will find this out and call us. So I did pick up the phone. I think Matt, I said, can we talk? And the reason I wanted to talk, I wanted to tell him, please do not run this story. And I was so worried immediately. And it was like, you know, like one of those moments I have never talked to journalists before this. I mean, I talked about paper came out and what's the meaning of this. And, you know, I studied how brain develops. I studied neurodevelopmental disorders. So it was very easy to talk about those studies because, we found the gene, this gene could, we could use this for screening, but this was really out of box type project and really what if research. So we really wanted to be sure that everything is checked before we do that, everything is checked while we are doing experiment. And we did not yet submit the paper. And I just felt that it's important that things are vetted properly, especially type of research that can be disruptive and potentially go into multiple directions. And science is not linear. And this was one of those projects that we wanted to really try to understand how public would react when they see this paper. And we suspected that people may be worried what is happening. And we spent a lot of effort, years thinking about this, talking to colleagues from our internally to externally. And so I was just unprepared. And so considering, the nature of the project, I really did not want, I was so anxious, I was so worried, and I really pleaded to him on the phone, please, you can be embedded with us, please just don't run the story, not because I didn't want the story to, I knew that this is going to engage public, that we knew that from pretty much when we started to think about these experiments. And this is why we put a lot of effort in thinking how to do the things and experiment, because it was like one of those what if research. And so, you want to give moral consideration to everything you do in your life, let alone something that can be disruptive. And I think Sid has really eloquently described some of the issues. And overall, I thought it was a fantastic experience. I think Matt has helped me tremendously lower my anxiety levels, okay? And I was so happy for a while because he was very polite and patient. Yes, he did email me all the time, but there was no aggressiveness and he was willing to wait and talk. And I said, that's what we need. And so we were extremely excited, we are putting paper together. And then suddenly here is another phone call, an email, how we would like to run the story. So I did the same thing as with Matt. I said, please, could you wait with the story until it's, we actually, we just get back reviews. And we just said, actually reviews are fantastic. I have never received better reviews. And actually the only reason we waited, we wanted to do a few more things that actually reviewers did not even ask us. And I said, can you just wait a little bit, because I think it's important that it's vetted. It's the same thing. This is, I think, the role of science and journalism is, this is why we have a peer review. This is not a, this was an incredibly unusual project or study. So I felt that it's very important that people don't jump on conclusion, that there is no conspiracy theory, there is no sensationalism, including, and so I felt that it's very important that, and Matt did that, and that was incredibly helpful. And I think that the science had, the journalism, they have to explain public how things are done, and I think that's important because we don't know how things are done public, and it's the same thing as a surgery, If we let people see how surgeries are done or don't explain them that, the surgeons do some things, I think people will be, worried, and I think this is very important to explain to public. And I think he has done an incredible job, and just dealing with my anxiety was an important aspect of all of this, okay?
Yeah, that's really great. And I really like how you beautifully describe how you kind of co-created this process together. Both you and Matt shared we were both learning along the way. And I think you both had, I don't know if it's your temperament or what, but you both shared anxieties about getting this right. And I think it came out very, very well. Okay, so finally we have Dr. Cara Ramos. She is the Neuroethics Program Director and Chief of Neuroscience Content and Strategy at the Office of Neuroscience Communication and Engagement at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke at NIH. She is also the Executive Secretary of the Neuroethics Working Group of the NIH Brain Multi-Council Working Group. So this is how you know she's in policy. And she helped provide feedback on Dr. Sestan's work also as it was in progress. And she was a lead in NIH's communication efforts around Dr. Sestan's work. So Cara, could you talk a little bit about your thoughts about this story in terms of the communication strategy at NIH, which I know you thought deeply about, and your hope for how you wanted readers, what readers would take away from this reporting, and what worried you about having the story written?
Sure, thanks, Karen. I think just to parse a little bit what you said, I am a neuroscientist by training, but I have a really interesting job right now where I am sitting at this nexus of neuroethics and science communication at the Neurology Institute at NIH. So, you know, I think for me, I'm really interested in the relationship between neuroscience and society. And it's really important that we think of that as a bidirectional relationship, right? So in this country, the public supports science, both sort of intellectually, but also financially, and that publicly funded science should in turn support the public. I think it would be problematic if only scientists were deciding how science progresses, and I think the public should have a say. And that's especially true for science that could have a major impact on people. So just to say a little bit about sort of the context here, Nenad's project is part of the BRAIN Initiative, which is this flagship neuroscience effort across the federal government. NIH is now investing about $500 million a year in the BRAIN Initiative. And the goal is to deliver new tools and technologies that will allow scientists to finally start to understand how the brain functions at a circuit level. So Nenad was one of our early grantees with his BrainX system. And it's really phenomenal and exciting as a tool that we could use to bridge the gap between basic neuroscience and clinical research. And it provides a way for us to study complicated cell, circuit, and function in a way that we have not been able to do in a whole intact mammalian brain. And I think that there's, as Sid was eloquently describing, a lot of possibility there for us to be able to better help people who are suffering from things like brain injury or even heart attack, you know, where there's loss of blood flow to the brain. So as we were thinking about how to talk about this story, and we were really lucky that Nenad was so open to collaborating with us and, you know, sort of thinking over a long period of time how to talk about this. From my perspective, ethics was a really big part of the message, and I really wanted people to know that advances in brain science are coming fast and furious. And NIH is a leader in the effort to think about and actually address the ethical questions that are raised by studies like this that concern all of us. So I would say my worries were that it would be irresistible to frame this as reanimation, and that the coverage would overblow that sort of sci-fi angle and ignore the long, dutiful, maybe, you know, not as sort of exciting history of the ethics groundwork that we had been laying for years, that you and Sid were part of, with the consequence being that BrainX and this really promising avenue of science could be lost in the sense that, you know, there would be blowback in the public and we wouldn't be able to do this work anymore. And maybe even the BRAIN Initiative itself would be put at risk. So I think for me, the bottom line is that public trust in science is a precious thing. And I think it's great that, you know, we're gathering today to talk about this kind of a thing in this interdisciplinary format, to think about how our actions are working to either promote or, not in this case, I don't think, but sometimes erode public trust in science.
Yeah, thank you for summarizing that. And that was a lot to summarize because I know so much work went into everything that she discussed there. Wonderful. Okay, so now I'll turn this back over to Robin, who's going to talk a little bit about, with our panelists, Matt and Mike, about the story analysis.
Thanks, Karen. And I didn't, you know, it sounded as though when Matt approached the story to begin with, he wasn't thinking about ethics. I didn't mean to suggest that Matt wasn't thinking about ethics as he worked on it, because that's what we're going to spend the next 10 minutes talking about, is the way in which, Matt, you made some choices that were possibly sort of informed by your concern about how to present this in a non-sensationalized way. So you have a mention late in the story about the Duke meeting, at which people worried that if the experiment were spun the wrong way out to the public, it would set brain research back for decades. So I'd like you to talk about, if you could, how that was sort of in the back of your mind, because here you are putting many details of this research out into the public space. How much did you sort of think through and make certain decisions about how to write this up in a way that would assure that maybe it wasn't spun the wrong way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I remember that Mike and I had a long talk about about the credibility of the science, right? We had Mike can jump in when he gets a chance, but as I recall, he'd been approached earlier about there's a guy out there, an Italian scientist, who's doing some sort of extreme, outside the box, sensationalistic, head chopping stuff. And I recall that, like, one of the conversations that we had early on was, you know, we don't want that. Like, we don't want a story that is about someone who is not real, so to speak, and who is not really pursuing the science in a serious, substantial way. And that, we talked a lot about that, but the more I got to know Nenad, and the more, you know, we waited until Nenad's paper had been peer reviewed first. And just to be clear here, when Nenad was speaking about the two, the timeline here, what had happened was I reached out to him, and then MIT Technology Review, I think, reached out to him, and they ended up running the story. So it was kind of out there. So when the MIT technology story came out, Mike and I spent a lot of time talking about ethics then, because one of our huge concerns was we don't want to, on the one hand, we don't want to be sensationalistic and position this as something that it's not, because Nenad is a rigorous, serious scientist who brought a lot to bear on this project. But the other thing is, we didn't want to get people's hopes up too much, right? And this ended up getting written into the piece. And when I think about the ethics issues, to me, this was perhaps the most pressing. Like, I didn't want someone one day to pick up this article and be like, this is going to, by next year, save my aunt who has severe brain damage. And when I went to Yale, Nenad shared emails that he'd gotten after the MIT article, you know, along those same lines, like, you're gonna save my family members. And I know that was really important in the conception. We wanted to, and there's a really interesting tension here, right? Because on the one hand, you want people to pick up the magazine. You want to show them what is possible. You want to show them what kind of world this could lead to and all the potential. But at the same time, you don't want them to come away thinking this is going to be next year, that I am going to somehow, you know, some family member who's experienced severe brain trauma is going to be somehow brought back to life in the way that she once was. So it's like from a writer's standpoint, it's like, how do you cement in people's mind how big and amazing this is? Because it truly is amazing, without letting it go too far in the other direction. So those were, when I think about the ethical questions, those were the huge ones for me going in. And I'm not sure if that answers your question, Robin, but that's what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I wonder, Mike, were there times when Matt maybe went too far in the other direction where you had to pull him back? You know, was he sort of qualifying too much or talking to too many bioethicists? There weren't that many voices of the naysayers or the querulous voices in there. You know, it was almost like left to the reader to think about that. So I wonder if Matt had more of it and you thought that was extraneous, or?
No, I mean, I think when we, for me, I mean, we took a lot of our cues from Dr. Sestan in that this work was clearly amazing and fascinating and rigorous and thoughtful. And if we were to, you know, I think in my mind, the more of that we showed, the rigorousness, the thoughtfulness, the intentionality, the more it would, and I think it did, you know, help to set the table for that ethics conversation at the end of the piece, where there's less sort of explaining and theorizing about it, and more having just seen the actual, you know, the actual science in action and what led to this. And I think, you know, when it came to the final discussion, toward the end, you know, this was also happening pretty soon after we published. Like, a lot of this conversation was happening, we were so on this story that it was happening in front of us often. And so we were sort of following this and understanding it and learning more as we went. And so much so that, Matt would be calling people to introduce them to this work and then help elicit an ethics conversation about what was going on. So yes, I think for me, and I think for both of us, it was the real responsibility was showing it as clearly as we possibly could, and the reader then would be left to understand and sort of puzzle through it themselves. I don't think there was any intention for us to sort of say, none whatsoever. Here's what this is. Here's what it means for the future. It's just this is what's happening. You all can come to your own conclusions about it. That was the goal.
Right. Matt, can I ask you just sort of a craft question, and we only have a couple more minutes before we hear from the experts, and then again we're going to hear from the audience and get back to talking about this article. But you put yourself into it right at the beginning. In the very first sentence there was an I. So was there a reason? Were you somehow thinking of yourself as kind of the moderating influence in there?
That's interesting. I would say that has something to do with it, but it was really important to have, like, when we set out to set the structure of the piece, I knew, I think right away, that I wanted it to be almost like a quest story, right? That someone had an idea, he brought that idea to life, and these are the steps that he went through to realize it, and down to a literal eureka moment. So that is what made the piece possible. If Nenad had been boring and uninteresting, if he hadn't been a former heavy metal guitarist and had all these interesting facets to him, I think the story would have suffered for it. So when I think about the beginning, I think mostly about that, about bringing this person to life as a way of understanding the science. But then if you take one step back from that, it's like, I'm meeting him and he's my guide into the story, right? And I am generally pretty okay with inserting myself in the story a little. Like I try not to go overboard, because I think people get a little bored of it. But if in this case it was, if he was pursuing the science and I was learning about it in real time, I almost became like a stand-in for the reader, if that makes sense.
Okay. Let me ask you just quickly before we hand this over, that literal eureka moment, did Nenad really run down the hall shouting eureka, or was that sort of a apocryphal story?
I don't know, Nenad, that's true, isn't it? I hope so.
So I think so. Yeah. So there are two moments in the story. One is that when we actually didn't do perfusion of the brain first. We were trying to play with this, developing this perfusion solution, just to let you know. And then the idea actually to do perfusion came really from going to autopsy, and where somebody was doing that to fix the brain, and his name is Art Bellinger. And that was it. I came to his room and there was a really bucket of fixative on top shelf, and he was fixing the brain. And by just perfusion, and I realized that's what we need to do. And that was, I did go running to the lab back, and I said, we figured it out, we need to do this. Okay, and I actually remember first person I told was not a member of the project. He was somebody in the lab who was actually trained as a physician. And then I was like, I need to stop, I need to tell you. And I was, this is what I like about science. I was, it's like one of those really, what was good about the project, that there was no pressure for us to publish or anything. This is not something I was trying to do. This was just like out of box type of research. Okay, let's try to do this. Let's be very thoughtful. Let's just make sure that we checked every box. And then, thinking about, when I go back, how did we get the idea to go to slaughterhouse? But, we don't want to do this to the animal and stuff, so we really, but when you don't have that pressure, when you have that freedom to think and, be wise about hopefully what we do. But the second moment is that when we realized that this is working so well, they showed me double, blinded sections, and I said, you need to break this looks so, and that was really, just one of those rare moment in when that something, you have something special there. And I sat down, I started crying. That's the truth. And
Well,
and it's like,
Nenad, I'm going to turn this back over to Karen because I want to hear from you and also from your two colleagues about what it felt like to read this article.
Yeah, I think that's a good transition. So Nenad, if you wanted to finish that thought, we're going to move into some responses from our experts on some of the discussion about the story analysis. So you can please go finish, and then we'll have Sid and Cara chime in. Nenad, were you through it? Did we cut you off too early? Did you want to finish that thought?
I was done. I was just saying those were two special moments. One was realizing that, having that eureka moment, and it's, you know, we might come to that realization later, but it just happened that I was in for some completely unrelated reasons, talking to somebody else who was doing this, unrelated to what we were doing. And it really gave us an idea to do that. And then, I'm like a child in a sandbox. I was so excited that I think we may have a way to do this. But then how do you do it? That was another question. And so the second moment was not eureka, was just realization that this is really, and to me, those were more special moments, of the whole project.
Thank you, Nenad. You know what I really like about what Matt and Matthew ended up doing was sharing the story, and you're sharing your story too. And I think often people think about science as kind of this objective thing only that is somehow separate from culture and real life and humans behind it. And I think this did a really nice job. The article did a really nice job doing that. And I wondered if Cara or Sid, you wanted to respond a little bit about the storytelling aspect of this, or how it was built, and because I know you guys are thinking about the embedded cultural embeddedness in the narrative, even the whole process of science.
One of the things I really liked about the story that Matt wrote was that he talked a lot about the sort of process that they went through, and the trial and error and the failures, and just trying to figure all of these things out, which is not the piece that we typically get when we hear about science. When the MIT story first came out, and when all of the coverage about this first came out, we were basically just getting, reanimated pig brains and just sort of these sort of sensationalized stories about it. But we didn't get the story about how this developed, what they were trying to figure out along the way. And I think now in particular, where we have, sort of a loss of confidence in science, and where we're faced with this tremendous health crisis right now, where science is just so important, and being able to trust that there's a back and forth, there's trial and error, there's going to be mistakes, and we're going to revise what we know, and all of that. I think is really important that people sort of get that story about how science works, because otherwise you're thinking, well, they said this last month, but now they're saying something else. So they clearly don't know what they're talking about. And that's obviously not the right message for people to get out of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just to build on that, I was really struck by a comment that Matt just made a little while ago, and this certainly came through in the story, that he wanted to bring Nenad to life, and portraying scientists as human beings who are doing something that they love. And, I think that that's really important. And it, like Sid said, it's not what people often see. So I really appreciate that that's sort of the angle that Matt took. And what a great scientist to be profiling. Nenad is such an interesting person who's been doing really great research. I think also, just to echo something that Sid just said too, that, science is a process. It's not a set of immutable truths. I wish people understood that, because boy, I feel like right now that we're just seeing so much of what can go wrong when people, like you said, think, well, you changed your mind, but we're not flip-flopping, right? We're just incorporating new data and updating our understanding of things. And that's the normal process, but that's just not what people see. And so they don't realize that that's, what science looks like on the ground.
Wonderful. I'm just going to, at this moment, say that to our audience members, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A button at the end of your screen. And Robin and I will be moderating those and trying to get to as many of them as you can. So please go ahead and put those in if you haven't already. And I'll let you do that while I'm asking this last question. And it's that I loved actually one piece of the article at the end where it ended with one of Nenad's quotes, and he says, you know, he talks about the many decision points that he's had, and we've talked about how ethics is kind of useful for that and how the storytelling around that is important. And you know, he says this shouldn't be up to me alone to make all these decisions, and I thought that was really helpful. And I'm wondering, he says I shouldn't decide what we should do with this, basically, because ultimately this is something I want to give to humanity. Even, you know, he has very grand ideas, and I think both, you know, in science, that's what, at its best, we hope there's big social impact. What do you think? How should we be doing this together? Do you have ideas on how we might get there, just for the last couple minutes of the session? And that's to all three of you.
Well, I certainly agree that scientists don't have any special insight about what's valuable or important to everyone. So their work gets incorporated into our lives in ways that we sometimes can't predict and don't expect. And so I think it's really important that, you know, there's this attention to values and attention to what is valued and how something might fit into public values, social values, and all sorts of things like that. So I like that quote as well, because I think it's this kind of insight that, you know, he's a scientist, he's discovered something really extraordinary, but what happens to it after that is not necessarily in his control, nor should it be necessarily in his control. What happens with this research going forward is something that requires a deep conversation with science, with medicine, with the public, with all sorts of entities.
Great. Cara or Nenad, I see both of you, maybe your mics are off.
I mean, Sid did an excellent job. I don't know what to add to it, except that, you know, that's how I am as a person. That's how we do this. This was also a team effort, which I also wanted to say that Matt has done a really good job. You know, nothing is created in vacuum, but also nothing is created, you know, by just one person. And so I was very fortunate to have wonderful colleagues, and not just within the lab, but outside the lab. And I think for me, process of brainstorming and thinking about experiments is one of the most rewarding parts of science. And that we have a lot of that here, you know. And lastly, you know, as I just think that as a scientist, but as a human being, you have to really give moral consideration to everything you do in life. And, you know, and have to really think deeply, should we do this? If we do it, how we should do it? And I just how I am, you know, and that's how we do things in the lab. And there is not much there to, I mean, I just think it should be something more general, and people should be encouraged to think that way.
Thank you. Cara, do you want to say one last thing before we turn it over to the questions?
Sure. I mean, I think you're asking a really profound question, Karen. How do you actually get that public input? And I think about this all the time, you know, from the perspective of a funder of science. How do we make sure that the science that we're shepherding will reflect the interests of everyone? Because, you know, that's certainly not what happens now. And I think right now we're seeing a lot of tension around social injustice, and, you know, science is not immune to that. So I'm definitely interested in people's ideas of, you know, how can we do a better job of aligning science with everyone's, you know, needs and interests, not just people who've historically had more of a seat at the table.
That's great. And maybe our audience will have some questions to help us think through this as well. So I'll turn it over to Robin, who's going to start moderating the question panel, and I'll jump in as needed.
Okay. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, experts. And thank you, audience, because we've got several really interesting questions coming in already. This one is from Rachel Sturtz for Matt. Matt, you mentioned that revisiting this is revisiting the PTSD you got from reporting it. And we wonder, what was the emotional burden of getting this right? Did it intensify before and after it came out?
Well, Nenad was nice enough after it came out to write me an email to put my mind at ease that we'd gotten everything right. And I should add here too that we had two fact checkers on this story who worked with Nenad and his team and his scientists to make sure that everything was right. I think, you know, it was a matter of two things. It was a matter, the story itself became really detailed in the telling, because part of what was so amazing about this story is the leaps that Nenad and his team took, these sort of maybe not eureka moments, but like the what if moments. What if we tried this? And those were pretty technical, and I wanted to make sure that I got those really right. When I think about like the PTSD, I think about calling Mike like about to tear my brain out, having looked at like 300 pages of previous papers regarding brain science and just being totally lost. You know, like at some point I just got to a point in the process where I was like, I don't know, I read too much, and in an effort to immerse myself in what had previously been published, I ended up overloading myself in the brain, and that was hard. And I will say too that, you know, I remember really vividly, you know, there's a section 2 in every article. You know, it comes from the New Yorker idea where section 2 is where you pull back and look at the context. And Mike and I switched the section 2 a lot of times. It went back and forth a couple of times because we were like, where does this research fit? Is this about cell death? Is this about reanimation? Is this about something else? And we landed, even though we landed on the reanimation because it's what had drawn us in. I mean, we made clear that this is not Frankenstein. This is not like that. But it ended up being, I thought it was really important to talk about how for so many hundreds of years, people have been thinking about like what happens to dead brains, and, you know, is there some way to bring back something from them or to restore them in some way? And I do think we made the right choice, because the alternative would have been to go a little wonkier, and we knew we were writing for a general audience. But we spent a lot of time on that, as Mike can attest, like, you know, where exactly does this live? And because you're placing it for the reader, right? You're saying, here's this fascinating scientist who's doing important work, but then you're saying, this is why it matters. So, yeah.
Thank you, Matt. There's a question for Nenad that I think is really interesting from Shruti. Was the response you received from the readers and non-scientists different from the MIT article and this New York Times Magazine article? Do you think that Matt's article actually helped desensationalize the work?
Absolutely. I mean, it's as simple as that. And also I have to really give kudos to all other journalists. When paper came out, there were so many articles written, and I mean, I cannot find a single one that I was not pleased. I mean, there were a lot of sensationalism, Frankenstein, which, you know, it's good. You have to be sometimes funny. Actually, I had really absolutely no problem with that. And to me, it was funny. And some people make shirts, which I should have thought about it earlier, make some bucks. But so I think that was fantastic. It really helped us tremendously, because I think that, you know, I really generally support journalistic effort, and I think it's special to talk about research, and I think it's important to inform public and really facilitate dialogue and translate the meaning of a very technically, you know, it's hard for public to read, you know, papers and technical. So I think he has done an excellent job. I'm so grateful to him. The level of anxiety and misinformation that came from prematurely publishing something without really detail, and I think created like unwanted misinformed information from sensationalism, conspiracy theories. And also really the hardest part was also animal rights people, because we thought we did this to real pigs, which we did not, and actually really thought about it deeply. Actually, no animals were killed for this experiment. But really, Matt did mention that one of the hardest was like people emailing me, and actually I just got an email yesterday also about it, and it's just like, and you know, what do you tell them? You know, you don't have enough time to answer and then I feel, you know, and I think this was very important to make sure that this is not what people are thinking it is, you know, yet, and may never be.
Okay, great. Looks like we have another question from Andreas Stathopoulos. And this is an ethics question, which it makes me excited. Okay, what might be unanticipated ethical issues that we should have on our radar as scientists and writers? So, and I think anybody could answer that. But we certainly can start with our ethicists.
I think as this develops and as possibly applications for this develops, we need to think a little more about brain death and what it actually means for a brain to be dead. So we've had this sort of functional understanding of this that dates back to the 1960s when the concept sort of first emerges and is defined. But I think we are going to have to think about, how much function, what kind of function counts for something to still be considered dead. I mean, if we can keep cells alive or tissue alive, right, is that something that is alive? So I think we need to think about that. And I think people are already doing that. Around the same time that Nenad's research was coming out, we were also thinking about this in the context of the Jahai McMath story and what happened with her. And that is also making us sort of look again at what brain death means and how we should treat that. And of course, there's a great deal of clinical practice that is happening right now, which is sort of premised on this notion that a lot of brain injuries are simply untreatable and sort of hopeless cases. And should this develop into something where there's potential to use it to perhaps preserve brains or save brains until something else, or until they can heal themselves or something, then we also need to sort of rethink some of those clinical practices. But again, these might be far future possibilities where this has developed in a way that it isn't currently developed.
Okay, does anybody else have a response to that? Okay, I'll pass it back to Robin.
Okay, we have another journalism process kind of story from Camille Carlisle. She says there's great potential for exploring these issues in a long article. Do you have suggestions for how to do the same in a shorter article? I think that maybe Mike can take this first as an editor.
I am not a specialist on shorter articles. I don't know that I've been doing magazine stories and longer magazine stories for so long. I actually would be a terrible person to ask that question to.
Okay.
I mean, I mostly don't tackle thorny things, or I think the reason this story worked was because you got to know Nenad and who he was and what his intentions were, the way his mind worked, and then you got to see it in action, and then you got to see him and his team and the world grapple with the results. And I think that sort of, it's just the way the story unfolds and the way I think of stories. I wish I had some better tips on how to do them in a shorter version. But for me, I'm usually thinking in terms of trying to fit as much of it in so that the reader can actually come to their own conclusions.
Matt, do you agree that this needs to be a long article that you spend 2 years on for it to be as chewy as it turned out to be?
I'm in Mike's boat. Like I'm the person who hands in like 12,000 word drafts for 6,000 word stories. So I would say that in defense of magazine writing, that's what makes certain types of magazine writing so effective, that you do get to learn about the people behind it and you get to learn about it in depth. I personally think I guess the short answer is you could have done this. You could have done this shorter, but I feel like you'd lose so much. And partially what you'd lose or gain in a negative way is some of what came out of those early articles following the leak, where it was like, when you write short, your instinct is to grab people right away. And I may be worried that you'd grab people with the wrong information or something. I don't know. I also feel on the spot because I'm incapable.
You'd have to make some choices. You'd probably have to lose Nenad as a character, and you'd probably, if you were to try to tell the actual story, Matt's right. You'd wind up with stories that looked like the early reporting on it.
I'm just looking at the headline from the MIT article that came out, which was "Researchers are keeping pig brains alive outside the body." And I'll just say that's the wrong way to do it. I mean, first of all, it's not true. I mean, there's no sense in which we should think of this as an alive brain. It's a perfused brain from a decapitated pig that has been taken entirely out of the pig's body. So, you know, so one thing is, in a shorter form article, you're going to have to be really careful about your clickbaity headlines, even though you want to get people to read those things. There's a whole lot packed into that headline that is so incorrect and so sensational and just immediately gives people the wrong idea about what's going on. So use your words much more carefully when you have fewer of them to use.
Well, the headline in Matt's article wasn't that different, right? It was, scientists are giving dead brains new life. What could go wrong? I mean, it was.
Yeah, I was about to actually bring. I was about to bring that up. That was not you. No, it was not me. That was a long discussion. That was a long discussion in. You know, it's so interesting, this story in Nenad's work. It's, you know, it's writing this line, and what happens with, you know, editors and people who want, you know, who want this. It's the way the business works right now, and it's not good. You know, people want attention for the story, and so this one was so clearly teed up. And so, but it was that was a long discussion. I can't remember what the original headline was. I think we went through 4 or 5, and I think the new life was the hedge on alive, which of course, you know, life in that instance, new life is is fairly fungible, but yeah, it was not, you know, it was also fairly, it was leaning in.
Yeah. I think we have time for just one more question. Karen, do you want to ask the next one?
Sure, this is a nice process question. This is the story by Shreya Ghosh. The story involved active, open, and continuous communication between the journalist and the scientist. If there's a situation where such a relationship is impossible, for example, for an investigative report, how would one adapt the process of ethical inquiry for fact-checking?
So in other words, like no access to the person at all. So you'd be reporting around them. I mean, you end up with a really different story, right? I mean, I think the process point that I'd put first is you'd have to make every effort to understand what the scientist was trying to do if you didn't have access to them. So it would have to be a good faith investigation in which you say, you know I'm not going to get to scientist X, but I'm not going to dismiss him or her for that reason. I'm going to try to understand what they're doing. And maybe that involves talking with people who have cycled through their laboratory. It involves talking to the subject in an off the record capacity to at least say, hey, I'm going to do this. I just want some sort of input. I feel pretty strongly that you can't, to do it with no input from them or to not understand the person at all and to really weigh in on the science would be, you know, I guess you could do it, but would it work? And then you just rely on so many other voices, in short, right? And you'd have to really report it out. But even then, there'd be like a hole at the middle of your story, right, where you wouldn't really know what this person was thinking. And those are always the science stories I like the most. So I don't know. It would be a challenge, in short.
There's a related question. I guess we do have time for one more that comes from Jenny Coutaro. That's to Matt and Matthew, I guess. How can we balance the need to establish the kind of trust and rapport you accomplish with Nenad with the imperative to remain impartial when reporting a story? Was that ever a challenge for you as you worked with Nenad and his colleagues?
Well, I insisted on buying the pizza when we went out to dinner. So there was no financial transaction at play. I think I even bought the coffees. I hope I bought the coffees. But you know, it's a hard question with any subject, not just writing about scientists. I find that Mike mentioned the story we did before this was Sean Hannity, and I spent weeks with Sean Hannity, and you can you know, imagine how that went in your brain. And I guess what I try to do is listen to what people have to say and try to be a human being around them, but also make sure that they understand that that I'm going to be impartial when the story finally comes out, that I'm going to be fair, even though that sounds trite. With Nenad, that wasn't really a problem, right? I mean, we got along really well. We had a lot of fun talking. But, you know, there was an objective piece of science being discussed, right? And I did make sure to talk to a lot of other people in the space. I didn't just take his word for it. And, you know, I'll say this too, that I think I was looking through the Q&A and someone had been like, well, someone had asked about other dissenting voices. And, you know, I talked to a lot of people, and that dissent, so to speak, didn't exist. When the MIT article came out and people didn't fully understand it, there was anger or concern about what was happening. But when people did understand it, there was no one like burning down, pounding on Nenad's door and demanding he get fired because people understood the science. So people would be like, well, maybe I would have approached it this way, but he was also really careful and people recognized that. So in this situation, I didn't really have to deal with it. But I would just say, you know, it's good to spend time with people in a casual setting and to get to know them. And as long as everyone understands that this is going to result in an article, an objective one, then it usually turns out okay, I think.
Roz, do we have time for another question, or do we sort of need to
a quick one? A quick one, I think, and then we
okay. Okay, how about this one? Will be quick, from Brandy Jefferson. What would a better headline have been? I mean, I guess it's related to what the previous headlines maybe were, but and this is something that even the experts can weigh in on. How would you have liked to see a headline for a story like this?
I wish I had, because you read the web headline, which was different from the print headline. So I actually wish I could run and grab it and see what the actual headline was that we worked up. But yeah, I'd love to hear too.
Well, Cara, I know you had a kind of a cheat sheet of, you know, if you're interviewed by this, here's some tips on how people might misunderstand. How people might misunderstand what's going to be said. Did you have any ideas for title?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I empathize with the journalist trying to talk about this. You know, how do you talk about something so nuanced? I mean, I don't think I had an alternative title. It was more the sense that this isn't about restoring brain function, but rather it's about opening doors to being able to better understand how the brain works. But there really is a lot of kind of room for discussion around, like Sid was saying, what is brain death, and, you know, the fact that a person can be brain dead, but there can still be cellular activity in their brain. You know, that's not an easy thing to I think, sort of say to people. So I empathize with you guys. I think your job is hard, but I'm delighted to be having this conversation, like I said.
I'm looking at a headline from a blog which says, for the first time ever, scientists restore some cellular function in dead brains. I don't think that's bad. I mean, I think it's.
But I don't think that's true either.
Well, there was some cellular function, yes.
No, I mean, I think people had done it before, hadn't they?
Oh.
I mean, Nenad would know. Yeah.
Okay, I was focused on the part about restoring cellular function rather than bringing them back to life.
Mhm. Yeah.
Righty. Robin, you ready to wrap?
Yes, I think that I just want to thank everybody for coming. It's been a really interesting, enlightening hour for me. I hope nobody felt put on the hot seat or anything. Thank you so much for participating in this, and thank you, audience, for your really good questions.
And I obviously want to thank Robin and Karen who put all this together. Just a fabulous, I happen to know how much work it was behind the scenes, so not a small thing. So big round of thanks and applause to all panelists. Thank you everyone for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye all.